All right. Awesome.
All right.
How we doing? Great.
I'm good.
Well, thank you for sitting with me and talking into a microphone that's sitting on a music stand. I have a really high quality studio, obviously. So just to just kind of as to get started into everything. Right now, you're running a Kickstarter to fund an album that hasn't been recorded yet, or it's recorded and you're recouping costs for it.
Yeah, we've recorded, but we're raising funds for post-production expenses.
Mm-hmm. And this is Magic Mountain. Magic Mountain?
Right. Magic Mountain.
Yes. Why Magic Mountain? What's so magic about it?
Well, we borrowed the album's name from the 1924 novel by Thomas Mann called Der Zauberberg, or something like that in German. And the story in Magic Mountain, the novel, is about a young man, a fairly ordinary middle-class young man who goes to visit his cousin who's in a Swiss sanatorium in Davos, the top of this mountain. He's supposed to go visit him for 3 weeks and mysteriously ends up staying for 7 years. And the novel is really about this distortion of time and memory and about the disease of modernity. And it just questions every boundary that you have between our perceptions of time and time's reality, illness and health. Mm-hmm. What is me and what is society? And it's hilarious to boot. It's a darkly comic novel, and anyone who's ever spent any time convalescing or in a hospital could relate to many of the things.
So does the album follow the novel in a thematic sort of way, or is it more of a less direct influence?
It's more of an illusion. Mm-hmm. That's with an A. In the sense that, as improvisers, when we compose music, we really compose it on the spot. There's very little going on. We've got the stage, got a couple of microphones, we have 2 violas, 2 chairs, and that's it. But what's underneath the surface of that, as is the case with many things in life, the things that seem apparently effortless or natural actually rest on this sort of iceberg-like mass that's underneath the surface. Mm-hmm. And in this case, the material that we're drawing on is this vast body of musical knowledge that we've accumulated through, 70 collective years of practice. And there's also a particular story here about both of us being about the same age, staunchly at the start of middle age now.
This is you and your partner, Matt Maneri.
Yeah, and being violists, which is already kind of a weird and unusual instrument to encounter in the context of jazz. Mm-hmm. But people who had solid footing in European classical music, who kind of fought our way into the jazz world and into improvised music at a time and place that didn't necessarily support or encourage that. And yet, despite those similarities, there's a lot that's different between us. I mean, I ended up sort of fighting my way into Juilliard and completing my degree, whereas Matt really grew up at NEC. I mean, it was his sort of backyard in the sense that his father was a theory faculty there for nearly 40 years. So, and Matt started jazz studies as a violist. I think he took a GED and started school early and ended up leaving around age 16 or 17 from his undergraduate degrees because convinced of his desire to develop and learn music through doing it. Mm-hmm. And he spent the intervening years playing all over the world, touring with all kinds of performers and releasing hundreds of recordings. Whereas, my path into that was a little different. I mean, I stayed more or less solidly in school throughout all those years in one way or another, either as a student or a graduate student or teaching. So there's these differences that we have, and the differences in geography. I mean, he grew up in this really rich cosmopolitan areas of Brooklyn and Boston. I grew up in the wilds of northern Alberta. And the style of improvisation that we do is deeply personal. Matt's pretty familiar to audiences of improvised music, and some of the recordings that he did with his father in the 90s are pretty widely recognized as some of the most important recordings of 20th century jazz and improvised music. Whereas I'm kind of coming, in a sense, instead of as a mystery to me, right, where it is that this comes from in me.
So when you guys end up performing, recording together, I mean, when you're talking about two people sitting and improvising, sitting, whatever, and you're rehearsing or recording, like, what is it that what is it that you're doing? I mean, obviously you like, you're talking about like differing backgrounds and combining those to create something that you both love, but that's kind of like a theoretical way to think about it. I'm just curious about like the actual.
All right, let me give you another lens on that. Basically, in the sense of what it is that we're actually doing, we're actually working with very basic building blocks of music. Things like intervals, rhythm, time, dynamics, timbre, attack, pitch. And we're using them they're the simplest possible things, and yet if you look at just the notion of dynamics, for example, and you can see this in classical music easily, like, people playing on a very high level have an infinite range of control and complexity and sophistication in their use of dynamics, right? And yet the most unsatisfying music, when you listen to it, we have this human tendency to regress to the middle, right? It's just like everything's kind of this like boring mezzo forte all the time, right? Once in a while we got like a really loud bit in the brass or something, right? It's a question of like questioning. It's a question of questioning. It's on one level, what we're doing is trying to take these very simple things and use them to the richest possible level. So rather than being sort of bound by that sort of human, sort of boring drive to regress towards the mean and play everything the mezzo forte level, we're questioning what dynamic level each note needs to be. Because this passage is mezzo forte, does it not mean that the next note could be fortissimo, or the note after that could be pianissimo? And if you ever try to do that, just try to play a series of eighth notes in this tempo and try to make every note a different dynamic, it'll mess you up.
Yeah, it's not easy.
And then you realize how much of our work as musicians ends up being done in a kind of a rote sort of way, right? So the question is, to what degree are you exercising choice and voice in interpretation of a piece when you're not alive to the full potential of dynamics in that way? And that's just dynamics. We haven't even talked about like note choices or intervals. So in a sense, I think a lot of people think about improvisation as being kind of like throwing the shackles off, like letting it go. You're going to let it all hang out. Dude, let's just improvise, right? And so there's this notion of like abandonment or lassitude, or like letting go. And I think when we're playing, it's rather the opposite. It's a really profound discipline of being hyper aware and hyper present in the moment to the choices that you're making, and that in relationship to the choices the other person is making and what's unfolding. So one of the other really big things for us in terms of our approach to improvisation is the notion of form. And I think that that's something that might not be obvious to people at first, right? In that sense of like, if you're improvising, how could you have compositional form, right?
Well, I mean, I would say that might like appear to be the case on like a surface level, but I mean, if everything is, I hate to use this term, but if everything is like on a tenuous footing all the time, like that makes it very difficult. I mean, if you go and find the form and find like a structure, it makes it easier to present to people, and it makes, I mean, speaking from my own how I would approach something like that, you know, it makes either easier to work on or easier to grasp as a listener. And it seems to me, I mean, this is just a personal opinion, that like having a structure like that would make it would be almost, it would become imperative if everything else is in a greater state of flux. But that's just my opinion.
Yeah, but then it's a question of at what level are you hearing or thinking about or appreciating form. There are things that, you know, when I talk about that Magic Mountain thing, sort of that notion of like the mystery, like sort of the idea of the guy, Hans Castorp, the hero of the novel, sort of like ending up in this place where like, it's like you land in like another kingdom or an alternate reality. It's a little Star Trek-y, you know, right? And there's this sense of mystery and magic in that. And in my encounter with Matt, I mean, we have like what is undeniably in jazz parlance a great hookup, which means that we have this like fundamental sympathy for one another. Hookup does not mean what it means these days. No, this is like, it's that sense of profound empathy and rapport that comes together between musicians. It's rare, you know? You can't force it, you can't fake it, but you know that. You've played with people in that way where you guys just get each other, you understand one another's breath, you're able to inhabit one another's realities while you're playing together, right? It's something you can certainly cultivate, but there are some musical relationships that are just undeniably great like that, and they just work right away. And for us, that's always been the case. But one of the mysteries for me is like listening. I'll listen to that music, and although when I'm playing it, I experience it on one kind of like temporal experience level, which is like I'm very much in the moment, and it's happening, and I'm making choices, and it's like I'm in the middle. I used to box, and it's like almost like being in a boxing match with that kind of like technical, intellectual, physical, emotional, complete like synchronicity of all those things. And you're just in that zone, and you're not really aware of what's happening on the other, you know, beyond that. And then I would listen to the recording and be surprised by hearing the depth of formal structure and integrity that's happening wordlessly. Now, on the other hand, Matt has a capacity, and I don't know how he has this, it's partly genius and partly cultivated over decades, of being able to remember in practically to a photographic level of detail what's been played in an improvisation while he's playing. He can hear backwards and forwards in time. He thinks that way as he's playing.
Yeah.
So for him, everything after that first gesture, the first note that's played, everything that follows must be an extension of that. So it's both moving forward and it's also referring backwards to it. And I guess he maintains that I have the capacity to think that way too, although it doesn't manifest itself to me in the way that it does to him. Like I remember when we were sequencing that record, like choosing the tracks that we wanted to be on the record, we were driving in the car back from Pennsylvania, and he could remember out of, I don't know how many tracks we had, like maybe something like 36. He could remember every one of them and hold them in his mind and sequence them and choose them and say, like, I want these 9 tracks. And he could remember them and move them around in his mind and say, this is the order they should be in. Right?
That's pretty ridiculous.
Right. Well, there are these extraordinary ways of experiencing music, right? And they may not, you know, I'm not sure that we really have conversations like that around music very often anymore, about the depth to which it can be perceived and experienced and loved, and to the extent to which we are willing to live with it in struggle and in love.
Yeah.
You know? So now it's just kind of more like, all right, well, you know, everybody's got to like broaden out. Everybody's got to toughen up. Everybody has to take entrepreneurship classes. Everybody's got to do this stuff because, man, it's tough out there. It's kind of like, you know, it always reminds me of that. You remember that show, maybe, on Hill Street Blues from the 80s? No, of course
I am familiar with it, but I wasn't watching it while it was on.
No,
that's what you're asking.
But like the captain at the start of it, like the taglines, is always like, every show started with the same, it's a formulaic structure. It's kind of like Law and Order, like very soothing in that way, right?
Yeah.
And the captain would always start showing and be like, telling the cops about like what's gonna happen out that day, and
right?
what they got to watch out for, and who the bad guys are they're trying to catch. He'd always say, he'd end everything with going like, "Hey, let's be careful out there." And there's a sense of that kind of quality that I feel in the way that our conversations around music are unfolding right now, which is like, hey, it's going to be tough out there, guys. So, you got to have this stuff. But I think what's kind of missing from that conversation is that maybe it's a romantic or old-fashioned kind of way of thinking around music, but one in which this is something that has a profound capacity to activate deep parts of ourselves.
Yeah.
And to reach others in a profound way.
I think, and I don't know, because of the pounding of, it is hard. Whatever you say about it, when it comes down to it, it is hard to get through. But sometimes it's there's a tendency to turn what is an emotional art form into a series of like technical exercises. Show up. Oh, you're playing this. Well, this is exactly what you have to do. Don't forget this step, don't forget this step, don't forget this step. And if you do it all in the right sequence, you have a chair, or you have a, you're building a chair or a table, as opposed to, creating something to give to someone that's not just an ordinary everyday object.
Yeah, and I think also that people's attitudes and values around music right now are a little bit clouded by, or crowded by a feeling or a fear of scarcity and fear. That there's only this many jobs available in this many orchestras. There's only this many paths available to you, and it's going to be tough out there. So when people start thinking about auditioning, they think like, okay, I'm going to get like super, super technical about this.
Right.
I'm going to just like nail this down, right? And I'm not sure that, although, these extraordinary advances have been made in the sort of the technology of instrumental performance, like what it takes to become a top-notch concert violinist, for example, the pedagogy of music, the science of understanding how bodies and instruments work together and what to do in order to get that way. This just keeps growing and growing and growing, but sometimes what I feel I miss is a corresponding conversation about, the things like, why do we do this, and what does it matter, and who are we in this?
Well, and I think, this is a completely different conversation, but part of that is a response to a process in which technical perfection is valued over artistic expression. And you because when you're in an audition format, you've got like, for a large job, you'll have thousands of people sending in a tape, and hundreds of people showing up to a live audition, and the only way to even be considered, especially if you don't have a decent resume backing you up, is to play that perfectly and play technically perfectly with, and I'm not going to say neuter, because people who win these jobs are generally also good musicians. But there is like a neutering that occurs because what you're working for requires that kind of approach in a way, just because the sheer, and it comes back to the idea, there's a scarcity and et cetera, et cetera.
But then the consequence is that you have this really narrowing in scope of like what it is that a musician is and what music can be, and that's just sad.
Yeah, I mean the idea of an orchestra, and I mean, if you were to talk to people that are close to me, they could, they would tell you about my opinions on orchestral playing and the orchestra format. But it comes down to the orchestra sort of becoming a musical jukebox, or and a very old one at that. You pay your $50 or way more, depending on where you are, and they spit out your favorite tunes from the 1880s. But
then we have people like reinventing the orchestra all the time.
Yeah.
And that's, there's always like a happy side to that.
Exactly. There's never, things are never as one-dimensional as you might think.
And one other sort of positive side to that I would see is that when I talk to students who are really passionate about orchestral playing, their sense of their value of what an orchestra is and can be, and what an orchestra can bring to a community, and what an orchestra can bring to their lives is so much faster, like vastly more rich than it was like when I was in school, and it was just like, just to take some auditions and get a job.
I'm a big fan of all of that end of orchestral playing. Community involvement and the things that they can do for people. It's just the jobbiness of it.
Right, but I mean, so you get into this problem, I suppose, where there's one method of valuation of a performer, right, which is the degree to which you can execute things with technical precision, and presumably also some measure of understanding of what, I have a friend who was, before he passed away, a music theorist who was working on geography of music. And he was working on a theoretical sort of analysis of how you can hear geography in an orchestra sounds, like how you could hear Berlin in the Berlin Symphony, and think, or Berlin Philharmonic, whatever. Sorry, I totally screwed that up. He was working on this analysis of how you could hear Berlin in the Berlin Philharmonic. You sound like I know what I'm talking about. But, which is something that musicians understand on an intuitive kind of level. Like, we know what the sound is of, like, once you really get into it. I mean, look, just to go to cycle back to talking about our conversation about, my work with a viola duet, and on what level does one apprehend that. For most people listening to the Philadelphia Orchestra, the New York Phil, they're not going to hear one bit of difference. To someone else who is deeply enculturated, who has spent their time immersing themselves in the sound worlds of those two orchestras, they can hear it. Do you know the degree to which you can hear and recognize one player over anotone? My dog used to be able to recognize my violin on a recording and could tell it out from anyone else's, and he would like howl if I put a record on where I was playing. Right? It's that the depth to which we perceive, right? Which is something that we don't. It's going on all the time in us, but are we activating that? Are we attuned to it? To different degrees, and I think that that's one of the sort of the basic sort of aesthetic or philosophical challenges that I'm really interested in is how deeply can we listen? Do we listen only with our ears? Are we listening with our judgment? How do we listen with our eyes? How do we listen with, all these other parts of our experience?
So,
sorry, that was super abstract.
No. Not necessarily. It makes sense. But I'm curious about how you got to that point where you're considering these things, trying to understand or looking at things far, far deeper than the casual listener would. Because of just the sheer amount of things that there are, sometimes I feel like you have to be not, you don't have to be, no one has to be anything, but it's almost, to get to everything you want to get to, you almost have to gloss over things, just to preserve your own sanity. Mm-hmm. And it's difficult to take the time, or force yourself to take the time and go beyond that.
Yeah.
So, I mean, just, what kind of pushed you in the direction that you ended up going in?
Well, it would be hard for me to choose like one force or one impetus that did that.
Too bad. There's only one. You can only pick one.
Well, I would say that if I were a specialist in anything, it was just a specialist in being me. Mm-hmm. Right? Whatever that might entail, and over. Let's see.
I mean, I was joking about the one thing, but
no, I know, no. But I'm trying to answer this thoughtfully and yet being like cute at the same time.
We appreciate it, funny and such.
I know. So I was just thinking that, like, with the different shapes that took in my life over, say, the past 25, 30 years. I mean, I think I decided to be a serious musician, like 30, 31 years ago, when I was about 14 or 15. Wow, that's crazy. So, and from that point on, that one decision said, this is what I want to do, just basically instigated a series of profound struggles, right? A struggle with my parents, who were, of course, wanted me to choose a professional path that would offer something a little bit more predictable and reliable, and a sense of reward for my labor. From my teachers in high school, my music teachers, who didn't necessarily believe that I had what it took to go where I said I wanted to go. So the teachers who say, you're gifted. I think when my teacher told my parents that I was gifted but not talented, or talented but not gifted. I could never remember which one it was. But, there's still, like, there's a point. There's, like, a judgment call being made that says, yes, you are allowed to go on. No, you are not. Right? And our lives are rife with people who are passing judgment on whether or not we're allowed to go forward with simply being ourselves. And, so what pushed me towards that point of, like, now doing what sounds like a pretty obscure artistic practice of making music up on the spot with other people in a very particular and idiosyncratic way. It was the outgrowth of many such moments like that. So who I thought I was going to be in my quest for, like, an authentic life, like who I thought that was going to be when I was 16 was that. Did you ever see that movie, A Late Quartet?
Yes.
Philip Seymour Hoffman. Oh my God.
Enjoyed it very
Total
much.
identity crisis when I saw that movie, because I thought, oh my God, that's the life I thought I wanted. And I'm so glad I don't have it. Because they're really mean to each other, right?
Yeah.
But that's kind of what I imagined my life was going to be like when I was 16. So I thought, I'm going to audition for Juilliard and Curtis, and it's unheard of. It was this great act of audacity for me, like for a girl from, a poor family in Alberta, in 1984 to say, yeah, I'm going to audition for Juilliard or Curtis.
Right.
And then to actually get those auditions, and then to ace them, and then to get in, and then to land in New York when I was, like, still 17, and go into, like, massive culture shock, because, as it turns out, New York is nothing like Alberta. It's just, no. Now, I didn't know that there was, like, kids whose dads had their own Lear jets.
Oh, yeah, it's a thing.
Right? And then, like, girls who go to Chanel on lunch break. Like, some crazy, crazy stuff. Like, suddenly seeing the world condensed into that place, seeing, great extremes of wealth and poverty.
Right.
In one place. And then also that all united under this, like, incredibly compelling narrative that says, like, you are the best in the world. You are here. You have made it. It's that New York, New York theme, cue that, right? And then the whole sort of the ethos of the Conservatory, which is one of conserving or guarding a history.
Right.
Right? And so there are gatekeepers everywhere along the way. So then, you know, the next set of struggles that I had is by then I had discovered jazz, and there I was living in New York City, so I wanted to play jazz because I was like,
Well,
you know, it was happening, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And then, you know, that introducing a set of conflicts with my teacher, who felt that engaging in non-classical music and improvisation was going to harm my technique and dilute my focus and deprive me of the discipline that I would need to become a world-class player. Right? And so again, we're still dealing with a relatively constrained notion of what it means to be a good musician.
I mean, from one of the most culturally important gatekeepers.
Right. It's funny, actually. I found my senior jury comments when I was digging through papers looking for stuff to help with the Kickstarter promotion. And I found the jury comments, and she actually said that she could have been a world-class player, but she lacked the discipline to do so. And I thought, like, wow, how strange to write about a 21-year-old girl in the past tense, like she's dead. Right?
Well, what, you know, that's such a... Even now, while Peter, you know, while these conservatories are still the gatekeepers that you mentioned, even though that there is still that there can sometimes still be that air of, no, do this, or you could do this if you didn't do this. Even though that still exists and is around, but it's so much. It would be very strange to see something like that on a comment sheet now.
Yeah.
Because, like, first of all, you're not allowed to write things that mean anymore because other people see them besides you and the student. But also because, like, even among the old guard, if you will, they've either died out or they've been softened up because it's just not that kind of... Right. Not as much of that kind of... Every school is pushing in a different, you know...
Although, you know, I kind of miss, like, the mean stuff in some ways, too. Because there's a way that you're just, like, telling it like it is. And you know who you're dealing with. When somebody says, hey, I wanted you to do this, you should have done that, and I'm angry with you because you didn't do that, you know where they stand.
Yeah.
You know what they mean. You know what you're dealing with. Right?
And if someone has that strong of a reaction... You're doing something. You're causing a reaction. I mean, if the person just didn't care or was just angry, you know, just...
Look, I think there were always great teachers, though, who operated on multiple levels at once, you know, like teachers who could both point out your lack of discipline or focus, but also try to understand what might motivate you. To do that, or to activate, like, another part of you, or who might be able to, like, look at you more holistically rather than seeing what it is that they want you to be, to grow up to be, you know, who could actually open themselves up to understanding who you are and who you are growing up to be.
Right.
And to honor that. And there's always been teachers who do that, and there still are now. But, you know, that was still these... I think what we forget, though, is that the judgments that we levy on other people, or that we levy on ourselves for that matter, are like big sort of refusals of who we actually are, and it does great violence. You know? So from that point, you know, if you had to, you know, if you would ask me then, like, you know, who am I going to be as a musician? I mean, then I was playing in rock bands, and I was doing all kinds of things that seemed kind of transgressive at the time that now seem like pretty tame, but back then it was pretty transgressive. Yeah. To play, you know, electric instruments, to play in bands and alternative clubs, tour around, and then come back to school and sit in orchestra. Now it's a lot more normative and accepted to do that. But so maybe then I would have mistaken transgression and, like, signs of, like, you know, badness or badassness as being somehow a marker of who I was. And that wasn't quite it either. So it's kind of like, you know, it's sounding like, what's her name? It was like Goldilocks. It was like, this porridge is too hot. But it's like a series of things like that. So, okay, so maybe who I am is a jazz musician. Maybe I'm not a musician at all. I quit playing for a few years, right? Or then maybe, you know, I resurrected that's so good. I resurrected myself. Yeah, that's grandiose.
A little bit.
And worked within the context of a jazz quartet, and did tunes that were like extremely through composed and that had like a lot of stuff in it, and like themes and development and backgrounds underneath solos and like codas and like mixed meters and all kinds of stuff, like like 4 or 5 pages on a chart,
right?
And I did that, and that was great. And then I did I did a number of other things, and I suppose in the end maybe it's just like a process of maturation to realize that I can do almost everything I want to do with the simplest of materials and building blocks.
Right.
But I think there's also, there's like a market constraint situation here, which is that you have to brand yourself as an artist. And if you work exclusively in free improvisation, then everybody goes, oh, yeah, you're a free improviser. You belong in these venues. You play these kinds of festivals. Your records can be released by these labels. And if you do really well with that, they want you to make another record that sounds just like that. Mm-hmm. Right? But the reality is that most of us, I think, have like multiple sides and dimensions, and we get pigeonholed by genre. Mm-hmm. Right, by genre and genre cultures and musical communities. So even within this school, we got the new music people over there, right? And you got like historical performance people over there, and you've got,
and you have the jazz school on 2 completely separate floors. And
right. Let's not even talk about those kinds of like divisions, which are, it's sort of ridiculous that they persist. But even within classical music, we can't seem to speak to one another and to accept that we may be able to have like many forms of expression of who we are, or we may choose to love one thing for a while, but that it's all coming from the same essential source.
Yeah, I mean, I was speaking with a wonderful trombonist last week named Will Lang, he does a lot of commissioning and a lot of new music solos, and he has 2 fairly popular ensembles, new music ensembles. But he also does plays with St. Vincent or the dude from Sigaros or whatever. But he was speaking specifically about you have to be really careful, because if you get that new music label on your forehead, people will be hesitant to call you for something else. Mm-hmm. And this guy can, and these guys can do anything. A lot of them can sit in with a big band and take a couple choruses and sound amazing, but they have the new music label, so go play with was that Wet Ink or whatever. And yeah, so that I was just kind of trying to relate to the point you were making, very inefficiently.
Yeah, but I think that we also like, in our sort of vulnerable and messy processes of becoming who we are as people or musicians, we also tend to cling to certain kinds of genres or genre communities or, like zones of practice, because it feels a little bit safer like that. Like, oh, okay, maybe this is who I am. Maybe I am a free improviser, right? And I've always been a little uncomfortable with that, because I find that like way too limiting to say that there should be like any one particular sort of defining voice for who it is that you are. But on the other hand, there's also kind of like a market necessity to kind of hang your shingle out in some way and let people know who you are and what you're doing. And that's, maybe like for trombone guy that you were talking about there, like maybe one of the answers for that is really in the kinds of relationships and friendships you build with people then. Because as people get to know you, they know that actually the fact that you play new music doesn't mean that you also can't, get down with the latest big band or whatever, right? Or that you can't also play in a rock band, right?
Yeah.
So I think, the only antidote to that is that web of relationships that we build around us, right? Where people actually get to know you as you are.
Yeah, that's a crazy way to think about it. Like let people know who you are, and then you won't be categorized in some way you don't want. Brilliant.
Yeah, well, that's like a constant process of like self-inquiry, though, because, I mean, if I think back on it, like, all the times that I pinned my hopes on a particular band or a particular project or a particular way of being and, like, saying, like, okay, I'm just going to really ace this. I'm going to do really great at this, and this will be who I am, that it's kind of a relief at this point to just kind of, like, cast some of that off. That's also facilitated greatly, by the way, by the fact that I've made a transition from depending on freelance performance and performance income for the bulk of my income towards using the Conservatory as a source of patronage for my artistic life. Right. So the fact that my basic financial needs are met through contracts at NEC and Manus sort of frees me up to have like a more direct relationship to music.
Yeah. Which is kind of a funny thing. I've had teachers, or I have one particular teacher who would rail against academia as often crushing the life out of artistic discovery, self-discovery rather, and experimentation. But on the other hand, also a great place to get yourself money.
Nothing is one thing or the other, right? I mean, everything is what you bring to it, and the degree to which you go, going back to our discussion of dynamics. How do you think about the progression of ideas from one note to the next or one moment to the next? I mean, it's easy enough to get inured into a community, and then you go like, okay, well, this is just the way things are done at Manus, or this is just the way things are in this orchestra, and this is my job, and I'm going to just keep treading that same little path. It's another thing altogether to approach returning to that chair or returning to that building every day with a sense of freshness and possibility. Like, that this could actually be, wait a minute, I'm just making a bunch of assumptions. I'm not even making choices. Right. I'm operating out of habit, or I'm operating out of reactivity, right? Yeah. And so there's both, I think, to inhabit your life or to habit musical expression with that degree of freshness and clarity and authenticity requires, like, both this great empathy, like listening to yourself and listening to the people around you and listening to the environment around you, and then also having a kind of, like, indifference to it, so that you're able to hold your own ground. So it's one of these things that, like, this is all going to sound kind of... It's the importance of, like, not being too open and too loose and too indifferent about it, but not being too tight.
Yeah.
Right?
But the default frequently is on the too tight end. Default.
Yeah, but do you think about, like, what the job is of a thing like an orchestra or an institution of higher education, is that there's a certain sort of, like, mundane daily business of just being an institute of higher education, right? There are classes which require curricula, and they have competencies that have to be measured in some way, and you've got, like, X number of people that have to be moved through the whole thing. So we get into this kind of, like, this rote, or this sort of, there's like some, like, really sort of baseline pragmatic stuff that has to be dealt with.
I mean, on some level, it has to be a conveyor belt.
I don't.
It can be.
But I think, like, the whole mode of production, the whole mode of that could be completely reimagined. But I think we could also, something that I talk about with students in my classes a lot is, like, how could you reimagine your responsibilities as a student? What is your role and responsibility as a student? Is it to show up for class on time and, produce the required competencies, and score well on them? Or is your job to be a more active and engaged participant in this knowledge community? Like, are you not meant to be, like, generating your own knowledge and pulling your own meaning from this and participating in conversations, at least where you're invited to? And I find that people, for the most part, are, and I don't mean to say this about students, just people, for the most part, are reluctant to inhabit that responsibility.
Or, it's more work. It's
also terrifying,
Yeah.
right? Because if you really say who you are and what you think about something, when censure or rejection comes, you're getting rejected on a personal level, you know? And this time it's real.
Yeah, I mean, it's... there's, with regards to that, there's a stand-up comedian who I'm very fond of, Mike Birbiglia, who talks about that, where he says, you know, if you're in a play or in a movie or in something, you know, whatever, with a lot of people, you can say something like, you know, if you're in it, but, you know, it wasn't great. And, you know, people can say, oh, I didn't like the direction. I didn't like the photography. I didn't like the story. It wasn't great. But as a stand-up comedian, you go up on stage, and if people don't like it, they don't like you. Like your personality, it's not for me. I just go away now. And so like there's a similarity to that when you're producing something very personal musically as well, where, you know, something that is completely your own. Yeah. And when it comes down to, you know, the buck stops with you. It's you know, and it's easier to be content to stay out of that spotlight for your own personal mental health, perhaps.
Right. Or, you know, I was thinking about that with regards to the duo project. You know, that is really personal music that has, like, very little to do with any sort of pre-established sense of expectations of what this kind of music should sound like. And it is, I remember, like, a friend of mine who this is not about this project, but years ago when I first started really getting involved in free improvisation, I remember him telling me that I played the kind of music that was more fun to play than to listen to. And I felt really offended by that in some way, because I thought it was really flippant and dismissive, and I knew what he meant by it. But I thought it was really kind of a weird judgment to levy. Like, what is it exactly that makes it not fun to listen to? What are your expectations of music? I mean, do we really have to dumb music down so much to say that it needs to have, like, a really, like, obvious, like, you know, predictable patterns of pulse and meter? I mean, you know, when we're playing the duo, we could be feeling 3 meters simultaneously, right? In fact, Matt actually went through an exercise of transcribing the first thing from this, which is, like, totally revelatory, because I'm like, it's actually a sonata form, and, like, this whole thing is, like, going on. And we realize that there are multiple pulses going on at once. Now, if you were to turn that music into a notated score and present yourself as a composer playing that kind of music, it would be potentially received in a different way.
Yeah, of course.
Right? Because, oh, here's somebody writing. Either somebody would say, oh, that's just, like, super complex, dense, ultra-mathematical new music, right? Because now you've represented it in textual form, and that introduces certain kinds of, like, structures or ways of understanding what's going on. It also introduces the notion of a composer as an author or as an authority. Right. Where you can go, like, oh, yeah, okay.
This is the only way to do it.
Right, but also, like, in that sense that, like, there's someone upon whom to attach the glory or the blame, you know? Right? So when you think about, like, the pantheon of American composers, right? And then like, your classical music composers, and then, like, the pantheon of, like, you know, American modernist composers, and we go, okay, yeah, like, I can understand what a composer is. Yeah. Right? And then in the case of improvisation, you know, it becomes very difficult to say who the composer is. Right. Like, who or what is making these decisions. Right? Yeah. So this is a really beautiful confounding thing that happens in that. But again, to go back to my friend who said the thing about more fun to play than to listen to, there's also a sense of, like, what do we think, you know, for whom do we play and why? Again, like, that sense of indifference and empathy being in perfect suspension.
Right. Well, That's I think that's like a hard thing to approach. More fun to play than to listen to. I mean,
there's just so many closures in that sentence. It suggests that music has to be fun to listen to, and who's fun, right? It also suggests that people who there's a whole thing that it says that, like, okay, if you aren't musically literate or sophisticated or right up there, like, listening to this kind of, like, super dense, complex music, then you're not capable of appreciating this, so it's not going to be fun for you, right? Whereas my experience of playing with Matt in that form, one thing I like about it best is that it's a different experience to listen to a recording than it is to hear
something,
a live performance. But our experience has been time and time again when we play as a duo that people who never, ever would have expected to like this style of music, whatever you want to call it, are moved.
Yeah.
Are, like, they come and talk to us. They tell us, like, that was amazing, right?
And that statement is kind of, it's kind of an insult to both the musician and the audience.
It's totally an insult to the audience.
It's, assuming that someone can't, it's... I don't know. Of course, performing live is also, more. There's so much more to it than just what notes are coming out on stage as well. So then that actually segs into something that I kind of was curious about when you are performing live, something that is something like that, where it's a little more tangled and difficult, from a traditional point of view, if you will. How do you go about relating it to an audience? Something that there's probably a 0.01% chance that they've heard anything like it before.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah.
I mean, do you think about that in advance? What kind of, I don't want to say problems, but what kind of what are the things that you kind of wrestle with when you're approaching something like that?
So I think, first of all, everything has to come from a platform of a sense of worthiness, right? If you come at it from a sense of, like, defensive-ness, of saying, like, okay, nobody's going to like this because this is, like, weird free improvised music played by violas, right? You're starting off on the wrong path. Right. So first of all, it's just having the sense of your own value, of saying that I have a voice, I have a sound that only I can make, that is worth hearing. I have something to offer and to say in this. That's, like, the first starting point. So second thing is coming in, I was thinking about, like, times when we've played at NEC or at Manus or in, like, little tiny, like, house concert situations or little venues where people weren't necessarily coming to hear us as free improvisers, where they were hearing music, but it wasn't, like, explicitly a free improvisation genre path that says, yes, you know what you're getting when you buy your ticket to this show. And some of the things that strike me about this are, I guess most of the time when we think about performance, we think about the envelope of performance sort of starting when the musicians walk on stage and ending when they leave the stage. They take the bow and it's over. Whereas I think that the envelope of performance extends in concentric circles and radiates out, like, infinitely. Right. So one ring might be what happens right beforehand. Are you hiding out in the green room? Or are you in the room speaking to people? Do they see you moving around? Do they see you outside having a cigarette, Do you talk to people? Do you smile at them? Do you make eye contact? Or do you hold to some sort of, like, mysterious, like, hard and fast, like,
performer audience divide?
Right. And I'm usually, like, my performances, I'm always, like, so delighted when people come, because I have a lot of people from all different walks of life, and I find it, like, just so richly rewarding when all these different people come to sit together to join in listening and receiving together. I mean, I just think it's like freaking awesome. I think it's like the coolest thing, and not to be taken for granted. So, you know, one of those things is just like, do people see us just walking around being normal and smiling and saying, this is a good thing?
Right.
This is not like a hush-hush, like secret, like, no, it's just super intense. You may not speak with us.
May not speak with us. Here's our thing.
Right.
I'm going to come on stage. Here's my thing. I don't really care whether or not you like it. If you like it, I might talk to you.
Oh,
if not, then fuck you.
I mean, I think that there's an arrogant and harsh kind of indifference, and then there's a wise kind of indifference, right? And I believe that the wise indifference is essential, right? Like, you can't be playing towards other people's sort of approval. Yeah. Right? But so here's another thing. Like, what about how your body is on stage? You know, you kind of shuffling on a stage and it's like you just kind of skulk into your chair and be like, all right, I guess we'll start. I mean, every angle of your body, how you hold your shoulders. I mean, you think about dogs when they meet each other in the dog park, you know, how they know like who's who and who's the boss, right? We're sending out like so many signals about who we are and what we believe about ourselves and the worth and the value of our work from just the way we stand. And I have a good friend, the actor Paul Hecht, who once came to give us a coaching from an actorly standpoint, and he really messed us up just with the question of how do you sit in a chair. And he demonstrated 20 different ways to sit in a chair. I was like, damn it. I'm never going to be able to do that. I'm never going to get sitting right.
I'm never going to sit and perform ever
But
again.
it was like, you have no idea, like, until you see an actor do this. Like, he said, here are 10 ways to enter a room. And every one of them was different, and every one of them told a different story, right? And so I think some of it has to do with, you know, in terms of making an environment that is open and welcoming to people, has to be, you know, to what degree are we showing who we are and showing people that we welcome them on the stage. So some of that is a little bit of talking, but not in that sort of super annoying, condescending, like overly interpretive, didactic talking from the stage thing. Yeah. But just freaking being yourself a little bit, or also not talking too much, or sometimes talking more, you know. But being relaxed and at ease in that space. And, you know, that's one thing. I mean, I think another thing is also just telling people that what we're doing is essentially composing on the spot. I mean, people always have a lot of questions. They're like, how much of that was composed and how much of it was improvised? Because in performance, you know, it really does seem like we're playing composed music oftentimes because we have these amazing sort of stops and starts and it's like moments of synchronicity and harmonies that happen that are just like, you know, how could you have done that?
Born out of playing together.
Yeah, like partly just, born out of being like really, really good musicians and having worked on this for a really long time. I mean, this is like, you know, let's not underestimate the fact that, you know, I guess we tend to think that our musical development stops somehow when you finish, like, I don't know, your graduate diploma or whatever it is that you're supposed to do these days, right? And it's like, now you're out there, you're in the world, you're a musician, but you don't stop. Right. You don't stop growing and learning and developing, and that knowledge that you get through the doing deepens and deepens. And so, like one of the nice things about getting older is at least you're like, hey, I actually know something. Maybe really hard to put in words, but there are things that I know. Some of it happens through having played together and sort of building a kind of a wordless vocabulary. I mean, going back to that notion of the title Magic Mountain, you know, though we don't deal with composition in a textual, encoded, written out, like manuscript paper kind of way, we are effectively composing. And we have a variety of sort of textual like shortcuts. Like Magic Mountain actually comes from this sense of saying we want to do an improvisation that could be like 20 minutes long. It's extended. It's very rich, right? But it feels like it was 3 minutes. Is it 3 minutes or 20 minutes? Which was it? That's the ethos of what Magic Mountain says. So let's do a Magic Mountain. right? Mm-hmm. That is a form of composition to have that under that shorthand.
Right.
Although that sounds more like, slang that you would share with a friend.
Yeah.
Right? But why shouldn't composition also be slang that you share with a friend?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I guess, maybe the other thing about breaking down some of those barriers between audiences and stages and stuff has to do with, because we mainly work in economically and culturally marginalized milieus, mm-hmm. and not, the high art temples of Lincoln Center and such. By necessity, most of the places where we play, when we play in jazz venues or improvised venues, are on the street.
Yeah.
Or of the street in some way, right?
Right.
So they're in the back room of Barbez, right? Where you're out front getting a glass of wine, or you're having a coffee, or you're standing out front talking to people until it's time to go into play. So there is this porousness, mm-hmm. of the experience. And I really like that.
Yeah. That kind of... if anything, I think that kind of... from an audience standpoint, it makes the performer more relatable. Mm-hmm. But from a musician's standpoint, I think it makes it easier to be yourself. When you do step on stage, it's easier to be yourself with this group of people.
But that's also just work that you have to do to be yourself. I mean, being yourself is hard work. God damn it. It's not like it sounds like everybody says, "Oh, just be yourself." Mm-hmm. It's a struggle. Right?
It is a struggle.
But the option, the alternative, is not. It's totally unacceptable.
Yeah, what do you get if you don't do that?
Yeah.
You get something that's not unique, not interesting, and not personal.
And that doesn't look and feel and sound like you. And that makes you feel like it's missing you,
mm-hmm. Yeah. So the Magic Mountain the funding campaign, mm-hmm. still ongoing. Mm-hmm. When does that end?
November 22nd.
November 22nd. Awesome. And close?
We're about 50% of the way right now, which is a pretty good place to be in for mm-hmm. a Kickstarter campaign. I'm about to embark on a invigorated last 3 weeks of a campaign. It is in those Mike Birbiglia sort of terms, a real point of vulnerability. Because when you put yourself out there asking people to hear and understand and write your story, you're also contravening one of the little rules of the artist-audience relationship, which is that somehow if you're a great artist, you're supposed to be above these mundane considerations.
You shouldn't have to ask for their money.
Right. And also that records just appear naturally. They don't cost anything. They're just like storks bring them.
Well, I mean, if you're a member of an orchestra, the big storks might as well just bring them. Because you don't have to put out the money for that.
Yeah, but I mean, the idea that to record really well, I mean, actually recording was pretty reasonable in terms of the expense here, because we recorded in Jordan Hall, which I have access to at a reduced faculty rate. It's a beautiful, beautiful concert hall at NEC mm-hmm. in Boston. But also the recording itself was about 7 hours or something that we spent in the hall one day. But much in the same way as I talk about that, the envelope of the performance radiating mm-hmm. much further out from just that moment on the stage. The envelope of a recording is much, much bigger, and that's why we make them. Is because it gives form and shape to something that would otherwise be very hard to pin down, mm-hmm. right? So it's a way of putting a pin in the map and saying this is where we were at this point in time. And it's also something that allows all these other people who could never be physically present to that moment to touch it. Mm-hmm. So it's a lot of things. There's a lot of good reasons to make a record, but one thing that it is not is cheap, right?
Yeah.
So then there's plenty of ways, in the improvised music world, there's a lot of people who'll do kind of, Shrekky kind of graphic design and like you just get like cheap photography or cheap graphic design and cheap this, cheap that. But we feel pretty personal and pretty profoundly about this music. And I think that music deserves to have a visual, its visualization in a way that is as deeply thought through, right? But now we live in this era where like everybody's a graphic designer, right? And the knowledge that comes from, so the designer that we're working with, Steve Byram, is somebody who has achieved a very high level of skill and in visualizing music. You know, he's been known for this for decades. And so the knowledge of like the trust that's implicit in like working with somebody who really knows what they're doing, who knows that a CD is different from an LP.
Yeah.
That you can't simply just scale down a design or scale it up, but that each one is a different object with a different set of stories and histories and ways to engage it, and like it feels different. Like just knowing that, you know, this is one of the nice things about self-releasing is that I'm able to
control all those things, or at least provide directions for all those things.
I'm able to provide so much more richness to the product, right? Than just saying, okay, we made the record, you know, now let's put some artwork on it and get it out there. So I think that my sort of historical time scale for how I imagine this, I think a lot of times, you know, people have different ways of thinking about this. Some people think, like, just do a record a year, just put them out, just crank them out. I'm kind of more like, make a record every 8 years, but really stand by it, really love it, you know?
So when is this all going to be officially released?
So the record should be out in May 2016, and with touring starting in June. We're looking at touring Canada, the Canadian jazz festivals in the end of June, and European touring that fall and winter.
That's awesome.
So, yeah.
And I have to say that one thing that I like about your Kickstarter campaign is that one of the perks you can get is the double LP of the record, which I love because I love having records.
Not just a single LP, but
it's a double LP.
A
double LP for the low contribution of only $30. I'm very happy about. Oh no, it was $30 plus the shipping. Anyway, $25, and to service all of you dirty hipsters out there. Such as myself. So that's all, you know, really awesome. I mean, that's really all I can say about it. Yeah. Mostly coming from a position where I don't have something like that at this point in my life. You kind of try things here and there. You're like, oh, I want to try this. Oh, I want to try this. But, you know, I was appreciative of the chance to, like, have a small part in what you're doing instead, at least for now. So, Tanya, thank you for taking time out of your schedule to sit with me.